you need your...
Tracking through here. Okay, so this talk is going to be in sort of two segments. The first couple slides are going to talk about oil shale in general, the variability in different kinds of processes, and then the second part of the talk will talk about our proposed process and why we think it will be very successful at meeting a lot of the concerns that people have raised. So we start out with the issues, and our previous speaker outlined pretty much these same points, so I think these are no surprise, and I suspect most everybody agrees that these really are the issues we have to be dealing with. I'd like to start by going through some historical information. This was a paper I published while at the Lawrence Livermore lab about 3 years ago, and there's two tables here, the top and the bottom. We'll go through them sequentially. The point of the first table is that there are a lot of different kinds of processes out there, and they are quite different in their characteristics. So if you try to say oil shale is a process is this or does this or whatever, it's most likely not going to be generally true. So you have to be very careful when you make any analysis of the situation. You're actually talking about a specific process, a specific location, because the details are different in very large ways. Now, this particular table has been updated. That actually also appears in Wikipedia, so you can look it up at your leisure. But you know, there are lots of different ways of generating and transferring heat to the shale, and that process can occur either above ground or below ground. And these are only there's probably a lot more processes that exist. In fact, when this particular table was made, EGL was the leaseholder. It's now AMSO, and I don't think Exxon Mobil process appears on there, but it does on the later process, the Wikipedia version, which I would encourage you to look at if you care. So the second point is getting to the point of energy need. And as I mentioned in the top, the energy from any given oil shale could come from a variety of different sources. It could come from char left on the shale. It could come from co-produced gas. It could come from natural gas imported into the plant. The reason one might want to do that is because the pyrolysis gas has a lot of C2, C4 compounds which have a greater economic value than methane. Methane is actually relatively low in value compared to crude oil in terms of dollars per BTU. So, and then of course you can generate, you can have processes around electricity, and that electricity can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from coal, it can come from natural gas, it can come from nuclear, it can come from solar, it can come from wind. And so there, you see there's just a whole variety of possibilities of what might happen. So what I've done here is I've gone through a few exemplary processes. The HRS was a Lawrence Livermore development. It was very similar to what Exxon was pursuing the Colin project. And you can see basically if you go to an above ground process, you can typically get a pretty good yield, 90 to 100%. If you go to an in situ process, you typically get a lower yield. I've used 80% here, maybe 70 to 80% is a reasonable range. And all these processes will generate a certain amount of carbon dioxide by pyrolysis, but depending on where they get their heat from, they will generate quite a different amount of carbon dioxide from the heat generation process. And then, depending on what temperature the shale is taken to, they may or may not decompose carbonates. So if you add all those sources together, you can see there's almost a 10-fold difference in the amount of carbon dioxide that is generated per barrel of oil. So when people make the statement, oil shale is, you know, so much worse than conventional petroleum of CO2, there are some assumptions in there which may in fact be quite wrong. And so I want to make sure that when people look at this issue, they look at it in specifics, because we have to really elevate the level of technical analysis here to something that is rigorously correct. So the other thing that I want to point out, and this was again before being involved in AMSO, I have Shell ICP in two forms. One is, and these are my calculations, these are not anything the companies have given, these are my calculations. They're qualitatively correct, they're quantitatively probably not quite right, because there's a lot of details in a given process. But I've shown two end members here. One where the Shell ICP is in fact an electric heating process with using coal to generate the electricity, And you can see that it's sort of mid-range as far as its CO2 generation. Shale has for years, and I don't know the details, I'm not privy to the details, been developing downhole burners. And I'm sure that if they had that technology in hand, ready to go, they would probably be using it. And that's my opinion. It's not anything that they have told me per se. And if they do that, then they will drastically reduce the amount of CO2 generated per barrel of oil. The AMSO process is of that type. We plan to use a downhole burner in our commercial operation, using either the pyrolysis gas or the methane, as I referred to. And the decision of what to do is an economic decision, because it costs you money to separate out the C2 to C4 components, but they have a higher value. So you have to work through the economics and do the analysis. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of context in one of the topics here, which is what is the energy use, or what will the energy requirements be? And the fact of the matter is it depends. It depends on what is pursued and how tax policy, etc., might affect the economics of different ways. For example, if there were a carbon tax put on, you would be sure that the carbon tax, the ones that are carbon intensive, would be at an economic disadvantage. So here are the leases. The yellow one is AMSO, formerly EGL. This gives you a little bit of history about our company. It's now currently owned 50% each by IDT Corporation and Total. IDT is the operating partner in the R&D phase. Total will be the operating partner in the commercial phase. There are other companies actively pursuing oil shale. Here's 3 examples. These are taken off of public presentations that these companies made. And you need to be aware that these are cartoons representing a snapshot in time. They don't really give you, any real detailed information about what their current thinking is. So I give you that caveat. But basically, the Shale one is talking about recovering the oil shale over, normally 1,000-foot type interval. And it's a lot of that is in the leach zone, where it's very highly porous and a lot of water there. And in that situation, you have to protect the water. There's just no choice, and that's why they do the freeze wall. And they just spent a lot of money developing and demonstrating freeze walls. Chevron is talking about some sort of proprietary fracturing inside the mahogany zone and some sort of a carbon dioxide supercritical extraction. We don't know very much about what they're doing, so they don't talk very much. Exxon is this other one here where they use a hydrofrac to and then prop it open with a conductive material, and then use essentially the heat diffusing from these planes. So there's an advantage of using the parallel plate heaters compared to the line source heaters in the shell. You need far less wells, and when you have these U wells, the surface disturbance from an Exxon Mobil type process would be far, far less than the geometry that's shown for Shell. By the way, Shell has actually done other things like that. So, but I will make the point that the reason that Exxon was in this lease is that people make the statement that private land is available. The fact is, private land is not available for an aqualytic oil shale, and that's why the 2 applicants in Colorado are going after aqualytic. So anyway, I'll quickly go through the AMSO stuff. This is our process. We're going through the lytic shale underneath is an aqualytic oil shale cap. We're going to avoid the water contamination. If you look at the royalty generation, there's actually quite a bit of money that would be generated by an activity as small as 100,000 barrels per day. But keep in mind that 100,000 barrels per day is still more than the Colorado still produces right now. And I can make a comment about royalties later. I think the current industry estimate is more like a barrel water per barrel of oil. A lot of analyses are using very old information, and in fact, the cost of cleaning up saline water has gone way down. There's lots of reasons why water is really not nearly as much of the issue as people tend to make it out. And projected to 1,000 barrel per day plant, you'd use nominally 1,000 barrels per day. That's a tenth of a percent of state water, and it would generate 1% of the state's GDP. So it has a tremendous economic gain in terms of its use. This is our process in terms of trying to minimize surface disturbance by using horizontal wells, less than 10%. surface disturbance. And the final slide here is, this shows that there has been a lot of work done historically on reclamation. Jack Clark, who's in the audience, was involved in this, Traxia, Rio Blanco. You can see the green area, which is fenced off, and the non-fenced off. That's where the non-fenced off areas where the feral horses come in and eat the grass. So that's another thing that we have to think about is how wildlife will affect this. Anyway, so that concludes my introductory remarks.
Our next speaker is Chase Huntley, who serves as policy advisor for clean energy issues in the Wilderness Society. He also has quite a bit of experience in the government as well. He was for more than 6 years at the Government Accountability Office, the investigative arm of the U.S. Congress, I think, maybe the federal agency that has given more people, well, just good opportunities to think about what they're doing, why they're doing it. So a really interesting position to have been in, and actually a number of other places in the federal government, but Chase Huntley.
Thanks, everyone. Forgive me while I refer to notes. I've been having talking more than the time allotted, and we've got a lot to cover today. I'm really excited to be at this session. I think it's an important and timely discussion. First, a little bit about me and the organization. I work with the Wilderness Society. I'm based out of Washington, D.C. Since 1935, the Wilderness Society has worked to preserve wild spaces and inspire Americans to care for wilderness areas. Our interest in oil shale development centers on the question of whether and how additional federal lands should be committed to this enterprise, given the significant resources already under private control, admittedly a little different than what some might want for in situ experimentation, and the large range of unknowns that I think we're going to hear a lot about today. At this point, we believe not. And those lands that are already handed over need to be producing more information than they have been. But I was asked today to speak a lot more broadly about oil shale and its role in our energy economy. Too often, oil shale is discussed in a vacuum, strictly in terms of its potential. And without question, it's got a lot of promise. But unlike conventional resources, where you have a litmus test you can apply that determines technical recoverability, we don't have that with oil shale. Instead, we have a narrative that tells us we are sitting on top of the Saudi Arabia of oil shale, which is partially responsible, I think, for a lot of the interest in seeking to find ways to tap it. With the absolute potential of oil shale is undisputable, obviously, but pursuing commercial scale developments, particularly on federal lands, has to be considered alongside other energy opportunities, not by itself. And more broadly in the context of a national and regional energy policy, especially when we consider the extent to which the federal government is being asked to support it with federal lands and perhaps additional federal funding. And in that regard, I want to center my remarks today on the central question I hope we hear repeated time and again throughout today's discussion. In short, oil shale for us boils down to whether or not the amount and the quality of energy that goes into extracting, upgrading, and refining kerogen derived from oil shale is really worth the socioeconomic and environmental costs of producing it. And at this stage in the game, I don't think we can clearly answer that. But let's break apart that discussion into a couple of pieces. We've already covered this, the classic EIA graphic of all the other things in the energy economy that we have to think about. Let's move first to this energy question, though, the question of energy balance. In other words, does the fuel produced from oil shale contain more energy than what went into producing it? And nothing in the existing literature, which is admittedly based on endeavors that have been published to date, suggests that this is so. Importantly, I think, though, the literature isn't small. The literature is far-reaching and extends back more than 2 decades. What I'm circling here is the margin of error for oil shale relative to a number of other energy sources. And in that bar and whisker plot, you can see the outer bound. Even if we look at the top level of what one might expect from the most optimistic EROI figures or energy return on investment numbers, we see that oil shale is far from certain to guaranteeing us levels of energy coming out of production that are on par with conventional resources, while we have other resources that might be able to do that. A second question I think is equally important, and maybe more so as we look to transition to a clean energy economy, is the type of fuels that are used to fire the heat that's required to finish baking shale. The Earth simply hasn't provided yet. It's a social question of trade-offs. What is the best use of electricity, of natural gas, of other energy inputs? Is it transmuting into a liquid fuel, or is it applying directly to other parts of the economy? Second, though, I think, and we've heard this already, we have to talk about the social burden of development. As most of the room probably know, shale oil produces a heavy distillate, which needs to be upgraded, transmitted, and then finally refined into a saleable product. The refining capacity in this region is not sufficient in any way to meet the expected levels of production. And so a substantial new infrastructure is going to need to be built that's capital intensive. And ultimately, the viability of many of these technologies will rely on broadly distributing those capital costs. I don't think any single industry is going to be able to make oil shale happen on their own, or any single company is going to be able to make it happen on their own. To put that in context, though, this is a region already benefiting from and experiencing the downsides of the significant energy boom for oil and natural gas development. Services, especially in the western part of this state, are being stretched to the breaking point. Oil shale has to be fit into an assessment of other ongoing activities. As the 2008 report from the Associated Governments of Northwest Colorado pointed out, a commercial-scale oil shale operation would add to the region's population by 25%, straining the ability of the governments to provide services like schools and safety services, pushing the skilled workers probably beyond the threshold of what's available, and straining the availability and affordability of housing. All of this needs to be considered when we look at the question of whether and how to move forward with developing these technologies. Let's talk a little bit about environmental consequences, though, and we'll be hearing a lot more about this later today, so I'm going to move through this rather quickly. The significant energy requirements required to produce something useful from the rock that's underground in the Green River Formation means that most studies suggest a greenhouse gas footprint, even for some of the in situ technologies, is 20 to 50% greater than conventional resources. Certainly that will vary based on the inputs that are used, but that begs the question, if natural gas is ultimately what's decided upon in a carbon-constrained economy where we can't afford to use coal to power this, how does that reconcile with the expectations many have for the role natural gas is going to play in transitioning our power sector to a cleaner, more sustainable energy economy? These trade-offs all have to be brought in mind, and they represent business risks to the companies like the one Alan represents today. Second, though, water, and we're going to hear, I know, a lot about this tomorrow. Obviously, water requirements vary. Without any field operations up and running at a scale to make determinations, we can only work off what the government's told us. 1 to 3 barrels per barrel of oil is the range we hear. However, I think, like with the greenhouse gas assumptions Alan talked about, water also has to account for other related expectations, such as for the refining sector and the power production sector, which pushes our estimates much closer to a 5 to 1, based on what we know. And groundwater fouling is as important as water availability. The safety of these technologies in terms of groundwater have yet to be demonstrated and need to be addressed. And of course, there's surface disruption. As we can see, there are a number of keystone species within the region of oil shale development. What you see here are the land use plans that the department finalized. And you see the range, greater salthouse, and other listed species. We've got to fit our expectations for oil shale into a region that has already experienced a great deal of pressure. Is really the only point here. It's not that it's a game stopper per se. Ultimately, the success for this enterprise relies on economies of scale to distribute these capital costs broadly, as I said. We must be sure that the scale of impacts against which we weigh our decisions today are commensurate with the scale of development implied by the promise that many point to. These are questions that clearly the department is thinking about, and we laud them for doing that, because these answers are the threshold to making determinations for whether and how we proceed. Ultimately, as I said, our decisions today are going to shape the course of oil shale development going forward. Without a tremendous return on energy invested in extraction, shale oil functions at this point on paper more like a massive effort to turn electricity or other energy sources into a liquid fuel, with a minor payback for that investment, when other cheaper options for use of those energy inputs seem to be available. Clearly, we need research to answer these questions, but early results suggest that heavy investment in this technology at this point in time is a distraction from other superior options to which our attention and our monies could be going. In our transition to a sustainable energy economy, we need to find alternative clean energy sources that offer higher returns comparable to conventional resources, instead of playing a shell game with our energy. We also need to look to energy sources with fewer impacts that can be managed with an affirmative stewardship duty as the carrying capacity of this landscape continues to diminish. Thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
This is where the yoga instructor, breathe deeply now, keep stretching, keep stretching. Our kind of a yoga instructor coming up next, actually, somebody who is really equally involved in renewable and fossil fuel issues. Michael Tupper is the Executive Vice President of Composite Technology Development. He's a mechanical engineer. He didn't get the memo about how important federal involvement was going to be in this, so I think you were our only panelist who's never worked for the federal government or a federal lab. Should we let him speak? I don't know. Maybe that actually adds a little bit to the reasons to have you speak. So, Mike Tupper.
I have to admit, though, our company has used a lot of your tax dollars to create some wonderful technology. One of the, so I'm third, so I get to have some reflection. I think one of the most interesting things that I've seen so far today is mostly what we're seeing up here are cartoons. And I think that's a pretty good indication that this is a very new and nascent technology and industry, and it's a very complex issue. And I think everything that has been said so far is completely right. Okay, but that doesn't mean that we can all point in one direction. So I really jumped at the opportunity to come and speak here, and because this really intersects a lot of the interests of my life. As I mentioned, we're a technology company developing technology for any and all energy resources that are coming near in the future and far in the future. So really, I'm interested in having an energy policy that really moves forward and provides a variety of sources. I'm also very interested in environmental stewardship and sustainability. So I'm also concerned about how our lifestyle and things that we do as a civilization impact the earth. Thirdly, I'm a very avid recreationalist, and I love driving my car to enjoy the wilds of Colorado. And that itself is a conflict. I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I'm going to quote Homer Simpson. And I think that the engineer in me just can't get away from these fundamental laws. And this is the second law of thermodynamics. And there's no way we can avoid these laws. And basically, there's a couple of interesting precepts here that the universe is constantly losing usable energy, and that no matter what we do, we're going to a lower state of order. And that's a very important thing to think, not only in a global sense, but also in the things that we do on a daily basis. And I think one of the things I didn't include here, there's another sort of interpretation of this second law, and that's basically, if we do nothing, we're still going to degrade. So even if we sit around and live in the trees like we used to, the world on its own, the sun and various things like that, will degrade over time. And the matter is time frame, and then how much the human can impact that by increasing that degradation. So this is a little bit controversial maybe, but it's really true that renewable energy sources are not necessarily clean, they're renewable, at least in the time frame of our civilization. The other thing is that fossil energy fuel sources are not necessarily more dirty, they're just not renewable. It doesn't mean that they don't have impact, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their impacts are completely and all the time greater than some of the potential renewable energy sources. And I'll show you some information about that. But most importantly, we're looking at a very, very complex system. And that's why I said everybody's opinion here was right. The gentleman from the federal government came up and said, we're doing these things, we have all these laws in place, but we all know that in 2 or 3 or 4 years, somebody else may be in this position and have a different opinion, and the direction of the government may change. And that's a reality that we live with, but as a community, we need to figure out how to move forward and keep pointing in the right directions. So again, as I mentioned, there's no free lunch. I won't go into the details of this, but this is a variety of different energy sources that are being considered. Professionally, I have technology for all of them, so I hope that all of them move forward, but they also do have their impact and their concerns. And this is something I got from the Union of Concerned Scientists, so it's not my making this up, and I won't go into detail, but you can find this on the web. I think one of the other things is the little green remark there that says most renewable sources are intermittent, and so therefore they require some sort of storage. Patty referred to the fact that we're so accustomed to turning on the faucet and getting hot water, turning on the lights, getting light. If we have a completely solar economy, we're not going to be able to turn those lights on at night without some sort of storage capability. The fossil fuels, as Alan referred to, does provide a potential for storage of some of these renewable energy sources. You can't have any discussion today about energy without talking about our lifestyle. And the fact that if, as a group here, we really wanted to make a big change quickly, conservation is by far the best way to go. And the energy needs in the country and around the world are growing. China and India are just starting to suck up all kinds of energy sources, and they don't have quite the integrity that we are trying to have in determining our energy future. So it's not really a local Colorado question, really is a global question. But we do like our lifestyles. And in fact, I made the comment on the bottom, and I was going to ask for a show of hands, but I won't. But how many people came in a car down here by themselves today? You know, that's a lifestyle change that we really need to consider making as we move forward. So conservation, we do live in an economic society. It may not be, we don't like to all admit it, but basically conservation will occur when people can make money off of conservation. And these are a couple of ways in which we may be able to do that. I won't go into the detail, but one of my favorite things is everybody loves to say, I recycle. But the mantra is really reduce, reuse, and recycle. The most effective thing to do is to reduce and never have to recycle. And these are just sort of global thought processes that I really think need to be part of the conversation that we're having today, as well as, you know, throughout our lives and looking at energy policy more broadly. So as I mentioned, energy use is increasing. Renewable sources do generally have a lower impact, but they're so far behind in infrastructure that we're talking about maybe being able to get 20% renewable energy sources by 2020 or 2030 in this country. And that's still a lofty goal, and I hope to get there. But we still have 70 or 80% of our energy sources that have to come from other places. And those things fall into the issues with the geopolitics and various other things, that the concept of having more decision-making capability and control over our energy sources, such as domestic sources as oil shale, really should be considered. The other alternatives have their positive sides and their negative sides, but I kind of put those in the order of where I think potentially the environmental impact potential could be associated with these different sources. And just as a reminder, most renewable sources do require a storage source, which does not exist yet. So locally, I think I really represent as how I introduced my talk, in the sense that I love Colorado, I love what it has to offer. I enjoy the economy here, I enjoy the environment here, and there's a certain, as Patty mentioned in some of her cartoons, it's a really very nice lifestyle to live here. But what we do here also affects what happens in the rest of the world. And unfortunately, there are decisions being made around the world that will impact us regardless of what we decide here today or in the future. And those are things that are all very important to keep in mind. So, big question, oil shale, promise or peril? And I think after just even the few speakers that we've had here, we don't know. We certainly don't know. But I think potentially the Institute process has a lot of promise, And it really needs to be, the development of that really needs to continue. And we need to start answering those questions, whether it is a promise or whether it is a peril. And I think that, as a community, we should provide guidance to the industry. And I thought it was interesting, I don't mean to pick on him, but our friend from the federal government said, we're going to look at a business model that's separate from socioeconomic, environmental, air. These companies would not be pursuing it unless they thought that there could be a positive business to come out of this. And in their business model, they are addressing all these types of things. But as a community, we need to make sure that they're open about it and that they answer the questions that we have to satisfy that the process and the approach is really going to be satisfactory to what we want to do moving forward. And industry's responsibility to the community is to have an open process, to look at a variety of different energy sources, and for them to arrive at what is overall the best source and solution for the community. And that will be an economically beneficial solution for the companies, and because of the activity of a lot of the people in the room and the federal government, that will also be one that should hopefully meet our environmental and socioeconomic needs as well. So, thank you.
We'll have a few minutes here for an exchange among the three, and I guess I would invite you, I certainly can't even ask or certainly could require, to imagine that we have hung out for a while and ended up in a bar and it's hours later now, so that you could consider saying to each other something in the framework of though I wouldn't necessarily have thought it earlier in the day, when you say the point about such and so, I really have to say you've got something there. But also, if you might think about where you would say, oh, I hope at some point you would really want to think a little bit more about or reconsider the point you made about such and so. If it could be pitched a little bit, it could be a coffee shop. I don't want to propose any particular fluid here, but if you were to approach your comments to each other, but of course the main thing is whatever you would like to say to each other after hearing the presentations for a few minutes. So, anyone want to? Okay.
Well, Chase, yes, you...
Are you close to the mic? I'm not sure.
I don't know. Is it on? Okay. So Chase, I actually read some of your material that was on the web, and your talk had a lot of those things. I'd like to address a couple issues. The issue of no energy gain, that comes up frequently. It's really a nonsensical issue in my view. Companies would not be pursuing some energy gain unless there were massive tax subsidies, like there is for the ethanol. In fact, there is no energy. There may be a slight energy gain for ethanol, but in fact, anybody who seriously looks at this knows that there's a substantial energy gain in oil shale. Estonia generates 95% of its electricity from oil shale. It wouldn't be doing that. To draw an analogy from the literature, oil shale having the same energy as baked potato. If you look at all the energy that it takes to grow a baked potato and all the water, I think you see that it's in fact really much more of a problem than oil shale. So it is certainly debatable as to whether or not the energy gain is 2 or 10. But when you draw your circle down there below 0, that's just really not credible. And I think you should really elevate to a little bit better, higher standard on that.
Can I respond?
Sure. What about it? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think anybody's saying that the energy return on investment of oil shale is 0. That's not what the graphic I presented said, and it wasn't my research. It's from a number of reputable scientists, including Cutler Cleveland, a well-known pioneer in the field of energy return on investment. The point I was trying to make is that we don't know what that return on investment is. Companies like yours and others are making gambles or investments based on what you believe to be what you're going to be able to get from that input. And they are sensitive to a number of different policy concerns: fiscal, environmental, price of carbon is obviously going to play on this. These are questions that, as Mike said, we don't have answers yet to. The question I posed at the beginning was striking that balance of figuring out whether the bang for our bucks is worth the consequences and risks associated with that development. I'm not here today saying no. I'm here saying let's slow down from where we were at 2 years ago and figure out how to proceed. And we've seen that corner turn by the new department, but what we haven't seen yet is the type of information that Mike referred to that would allow a more open, transparent discussion of what all of these data points are. We're working off a data set that was developed based on technologies from the 70s. We need to update that. It's an inadequate way to have this public discord. And I hope that your company and others will make available data that's not proprietary, but in a way so that we can have that discussion. Because I agree with you, the EROI is not 0, it's not 1, but we don't know where it's at.
Yes, okay, we certainly agree on that. And actually, the general statement, which even our company would agree, do we have enough information right now, today, to know whether or not we would go forward and want to do a commercial operation and make money? And the answer is no, we don't have enough information. That's why we're doing what we're doing, and we don't have any disagreement with the concept of needing to do an R&D to do that. There are a lot more technical issues here than most of the people in the audience really can even comprehend what they all are. So it does take a lot of work to get there. There is no argument there. I think the question is making sure that the regulatory environment is not so uncertain that that you have no idea what you're trading off. And so if you go back into the carbon CO2 issue, a lot of companies now are saying we want clarity in public policy because we need to make decisions on investment, and if we don't know what we're actually trading off, then that's an undue business risk that we have to assume. And I think the oil shale companies would like to have that as well. They're quite happy to essentially share that information, but they in fact, I think I heard once that one of the great assets of the United States compared to the rest of the world is the predictability of its legal system. So that if you're in a situation where everything is done by the whim of somebody, some official, then how can you make any rational decisions?
2 points on that. On uncertainty about carbon regulation, I would love to count you amongst the many supporters we're working with to pass an economy-wide cap on carbon. That certainly would lay down some certainty on what we think the carbon regime is going to be going forward. And that's probably a comment I'd throw out more at a bar than over coffee, understanding where things are at. But we're working toward that right now, and that is going to resolve a lot of questions. But uncertainty is an interesting prospect for oil shale when you look at the regulatory regime in place. From our view, there is nothing but uncertainty in the regulations that we feel were prematurely finalized. For example, the regulations that are currently written for commercial leasing and production don't even tell us whether we're going to be producing baking soda or we're going to be producing oil from the tracks that are put out there. The products that are brought off the leases right now under the current regulatory regime are not certain. There are a number of other uncertainties that we have raised in that regard. I can't agree with you more that it's very difficult to move forward in the face of this kind of uncertainty. And talking about oil shale, I liken to trying to grab a water balloon. Every time I try to get a piece of it, everything squishes everywhere else. And I hope that we do see some movement towards certainty both in the regulatory sphere and as we learn more about these technologies.
Okay, Mike?
So I can't resist to get in on this. This is too much fun.
I will say, it's really well played. So this is it's very nice.
Carbon tax, I guess, which is something I guess we can only talk about over beer, because tax is not a word you're allowed to say.
Beer may not be quite enough.
Beer may not be enough, that's right. But, the implication here by Chase was that if there's a carbon tax, that somebody involved in the energy industry would be against it, because the implication is the energy company would be paying this carbon tax. But who is using the product from the energy company? Shouldn't that carbon tax be paid at the pump or at the electric meter, where we as a community are actually determining how much carbon tax or carbon goes into the environment by our lifestyle, and not putting that burden on the suppliers of the energy that we all use and use to create our lifestyle. The other thing I wanted to point out is, as I mentioned, it's a very complex issue. And perhaps Alan does have more updated information on the details of the process, and maybe that is something that should be brought to the public eye. It's tough because there's a lot of competition there, and I think Chase is right that it would be better if those companies worked together instead of against each other, because that would probably be a much more cohesive and better way to get the information out and to realize whether there's technical feasibility here. And I think that, again, being the engineer that I am, We have not demonstrated technical feasibility of this process. We don't know that we can get this resource out of the ground in a way that would be acceptable not only to the producers and providers, but also us as users. And until we have the opportunity, and unfortunately, it doesn't happen overnight for a variety of reasons, both technical, financial, and policy-wise, until we have the opportunity to really have some of these companies go through the whole cycle and be able to give them a sense of, okay, yeah, I can see how this could work in a similar way to other industrial processes, and I can make money off of it, and I can do it in a way that I think would be acceptable to the other stakeholders in the matter. So it's very difficult to come after someone like Alan and say, you know, you're responsible for the amount of carbon, because he doesn't know how much carbon he's going to produce. He needs to move forward and do his research and development, and we need to allow him to do that. And yes, that's going to have an environmental impact, and yes, it's going to bring some socioeconomical impacts to the western slope, but look at the socioeconomic impact we have to live with every day outside the window. I mean, that's a big impact, and we're all satisfied with Denver being here. So, you know, I think that it's very important to break this down into bite-sized pieces and consider each one of those as we get more information.
Well, I'd just like to mention that there is this energy gain issue. Certainly the range is between 2 and 10. It's not that we don't know any given process better than a factor of 5. We actually do. It is more the variability of different processes as opposed to the uncertainty in any given process. There's certainly uncertainty in any given process, certainly, but that's a factor of more, maybe like a factor of 1.5, not a factor of 5. You mentioned also the issue of the heavy distillate. Published a paper in 1983 showing that if you did slow retorting under modest pressure, you got a 38 API gravity crude oil, and that's exactly what Shale then did demonstrate. It actually takes far less work to upgrade, and in fact, basically some modest hydrogenation of the product based on hydrogen co-produced with the oil can in fact give a lot of commercial product basically right there. So it's actually this is something any detailed commercial evaluation would have to go through, but it's maybe not quite as dire as you look there. The other thing was the strategic services. Rifle, when I first started going there a few years ago, it was really hard to get a motel room, and you had to make weeks in advance. Right now, a lot of hotels got built, and they're not full. They're begging for people. So the idea of stretch the limit, yes, certainly, in any short period of time, local services can be stretched, but by the same token, things can be accommodated. Right now, they've reached its hurdle. It's not actually stretched the limit. So I think that gets back to the earlier speaker. It's more a matter of making sure we have a deliberate pace and not turn everything into a crisis up or down. That's what local people really don't like to see.
So, Chief, a quick response?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm here today not suggesting that anything that's on the plate for oil shale is a crisis. When I look at where companies are at with their ability to produce commercially, we're decades away. The crisis is broader about the energy decisions that we're making today and how that's going to affect us tomorrow. And what I'm suggesting doesn't come down to any individual data point. It's on whole, on balance. Does the quality and amount of energy that goes into producing oil shale justify the impacts that this region will be asked to bear disproportionately? And I don't think we can answer that question. We need to continue to work toward it. We laud the work that the department is doing on their lands to pull information forward. Obviously, companies are working on private lands as well. And as that information comes in, we'll be in a better position to make decisions.
Okay, audience, we have about 10 or 11 minutes for some questions and discussion. Yeah.
My name is Jim Bartis. I'd like to ask Alan a question. We've had the RD&D leases in place now for quite a few years from the first round. Could you summarize what's going on the ground with those leases? Is anyone doing anything?
Well, let me see. I can't speak for Chevron or Shell. I can, by my own observation, Shell has put in lots of hydrological monitoring wells. I don't know what they've learned. I don't know what their plans are. Shale has put in a lot of hydrological monitoring wells as well. They put in a bit larger application and they withdrew it. They're doing most of their demonstration actually in private land adjacent to their public land. AMSO has no private resource. We have gone through the permitting process. I don't know how many permits we've gotten. We've got, it's certainly in double digits. We've gotten approval from the DRMS and the BLM. The last permit we have to do is for the EPA for an underground injection permit. We have an application in. We've drilled hydrological monitoring wells. We've done all the design work. We have contracts let for the surface facilities for processing oil and gas. That's the detailed design is going right now. It will go under construction in spring. We're basically pursuing aggressively both the engineering and the permitting issues, and it's kind of nip and tuck as to whether or not the rate that we can get permits is going to be the limiting factor or the engineering and construction.
Within a year, there are going to be breakings in ground.
Well, our desire is to have actually heat in the ground in December of this year. When you talk about breaking ground, we've already broken ground. We've made a number of drill bits. We drill pads. We've drilled lots of wells, so we've broken ground. That's past. What we're talking about now is breaking ground. The White River just put in the electric power poles to bring power to our site, and active construction will be in the spring and summer and fall with a desire to start heating in December. And we may or may not make that schedule. Just time will tell.
If I could make one point on that, I mean, I would say to the credit of AMSO and Allen's company, they have moved quicker than some of the other RD&D lease permits, despite having a change in ownership structure as well during the 3 years since the permits were granted by the BLM in 2007. But I think what's important to keep in mind for those who may not be as familiar with what we're talking about here, what we are looking at having constructed is not a commercial scale production facility. It's a facility that is going to be proving up a technology that will then require a major next step of capitalization for scaling up all of the operations. So again, you are close to getting some heat in the ground, but we are decades away from seeing commercial production.
You are exactly correct. In fact, the scale experiment that we're going to be doing in the fall is the same scale of experiment that Shale did a few years ago. So in terms of that, they are still ahead of us, even though they haven't done as much on their track. And this particular experiment here is a science and engineering experiment. It's not a demonstration plant. That is a later step. So there's no argument there. There's a reason why it's a 10-year lease. It takes a long time to be able to do all the steps you need to do.
My name is Rich Mignone. I work for the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. I worked for Colony back in the early 80s when it was in Arco's hands, before Exxon owned it. But I find the discussion on that energy return on investment a bit overly simplistic. When you're talking about it only in terms of a BTU basis, perhaps, but this is really a fuel switching issue that I see. And until you take your energy return on investment and look at it in terms of the dollar value of the energy input against the dollar value of the energy output, which is a different fuel, you can't do energy return on investment really well.
That's true. Methane is, I don't know, something maybe 1/3 the value of petroleum right now in terms of dollars per. Does anybody have a better number? I think it's higher than coal, but that's why ethanol, even though it may be energy break even, in fact, ethanol is an easier transportation fuel than methane to this point.
And to maybe add a point to that, it's a timely comment too. I couldn't agree more. But not all market values are going to show you the full costs of energy as well. There are some bigger social questions about the quality of the energy, some of which Congress is considering monetizing now, as I said, in the form of a climate and energy bill. But the National Academy of Sciences just released a study on the hidden cost of energy. Their calculations suggest that socially we're paying $120 billion a year in non-market costs associated with the energy system that we have in place. Energy return on investment is one of many metrics. It's conceptually an easy one, I think, to put forward. actually, in terms of calculations, is very complex when you start looking at how you do the calculations. But your point's well taken. I agree. There are a lot of hidden costs out there that need to be taken into account for.
Okay.
Just a comment on uncertainty. Uncertainty is only useful to evaluate if you might change your decision. It seems to me, therefore, that the federal government, although it's given encouraging words, has an affirmative duty to determine whether there would be a difference between its extreme values, 1 in 5 barrels of water per barrel produced. If there's no difference in the federal action, such an exercise would be, any further efforts to reduce the uncertainty would be a valueless exercise. And simply declaring we don't know enough about this yet is exactly the strategy taken by the previous administration with respect to CO2 in the atmosphere. I think we really need to be looking at careful questions about what is needed in the way of uncertainty reduction, and that is an affirmative duty for the federal government, which has the only, as far as I can tell, stewardship duty for the entire basin. And so therefore addressing those questions is something that there is very little in the way of funding for, certainly compared to the amount of subsidy to other energy resources. And it's a serious and important question. You know, if you want to get all your data from the companies, then you will have that questioned by people who don't like those companies. And so getting out there for independent research, which of course serves my interest as a university type, but nevertheless is one of your sources for independent evaluation without a political advocacy stance.
Well, I mean, I get paid to advocate. So when I say that in my organization's calculations, proceeding with commitment of additional federal lands to this enterprise, that's based on what we know now and what we think the alternatives are. That said, I couldn't agree with you more. We do need better information to be making, certainly for the government to be making the threshold determinations of whether and how to proceed. We have spent some time talking with folks in Congress, and we have talked with folks in the administration about ways that information provision and targeted research dollars could be going in that direction, understanding that ultimately their determination was slightly different than ours with regard to proceeding with the second round of research and development leases. I would hope to see that our information base right now, which largely rests on a report that the Office of Technology Assessment completed in 1981, does not become anything more than a dust collector on the bookshelf, that we get updated information to allow us to have this better conversation and to shrink these ranges. Until then, uncertainty is going to be a proxy for risk for all sides of this debate.
I have a very specific policy question about how all this discussion reflects on decisions which have recently been made or will soon be made. Partially due to the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and partially due to the initiatives of the previous administration, actions have been taken to set the table for commercial scale leasing, i.e. beyond the RD&D. Regulations are in place, land use plans are in place. But I've heard speakers here from AMSO and previously from Shale say that commercial production is decades away. Given the current state of the technology and research, is there any need or even any reason to do commercial leasing in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
I know of no plans from our company to pursue an additional lease. That's really all I can say. I can't speak for anybody else.
So does that mean if the federal government were to delay commercial leasing for another decade, that would not at all impede your company's plans?
Our plan is to demonstrate a commercially viable process, earn the 5,000 acre lease, and develop per commercial operation on that 5,000 acres. Certainly what we are concerned about is the royalty rate, because the royalty rate is the issue of the overall cost. And so to the extent that the commercial regulations that are promulgated for that program affect what we will be dealing with on our 5,000 acres, yeah, we would be interested. But I really can't answer that from our company, because it's really not something that we talk about that much.
I'm sorry to say, I think we're out of time, but I will say this, that I propose that the Natural Resources Center has a fundraiser in which they auction off an evening in a bar with these three. And if NRLC doesn't want that, the Second American West would take that, because I just thought that was really a wonderful exchange among you, and I really thank you very much for your time and your presentation.
Great, thanks, Candy. And we're going to take a short break now. We're going to reconvene right at 10:45.